Yep.
Okay.
So what we're going to do, we're going to present recent findings related to cognitive and emotional mechanisms in mental health and present novel insights into training paradigms that may be effective in ameliorating these mechanisms. So just kind of a few housekeeping remarks. We will have a total of 4 talks, each one lasting about 20 minutes, followed by a short panel discussion led by Professor Hadassah Konzinger. So after every talk, you'll have an option to ask questions, and we welcome you to do so. You can use the raise hand option, and we'll just allow you to speak and ask the question. And of course, we'll have hopefully lively discussion during the panel session at the end. Okay, so without further delays, let's move on to our first talk of the session. Please welcome Noor Givon Bengio from Haifa University, who will tell us about the role of fear in hierarchical processing of fear-related stimuli. So Noor, the floor is yours. Thank you. No, you're muted.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Once again, thank you for coming. My name is Noor, as Mo said, and I will be presenting my study that was conducted at the University of Haifa under the supervision of Professor Hadassah Konzinger. Just a sec. According to a widely accepted definition, visual objects are composed of hierarchical structures classified as either global or local, depending on their location in the hierarchy. For example, in a typical global local task, participants are shown a set of large letters constructed from small letters, and participants are asked to identify either the global letters or the small letters which composed it. Global precedence is indicated as a fast response to the global letter and with difficulty to report the local letters when they are inconsistent with the global letter due to interference from the global level. Previous studies have used the Nahum classic letter task in order to examine the role of fear and anxiety in hierarchical processing. Nearly 50 years of studies have consistently shown that fear and anxiety are associated with local rather than global bias. The findings of the studies were interpreted in the context of attention view, according to which anxiety narrows the attentional focus to the threat, hence improving processing of local elements. Even though a wealth of data has consistently demonstrated that fear-relevant information is processed in a unique and qualitatively different way than non-emotional information, the hierarchical processing of fear-relevant stimuli has never been examined. In order to fill this research gap, we developed an emotional modification of the global-local paradigm to examine hierarchical processing in spider and snake stimuli among participants with either high specific fear of spiders, study 1, or with high specific fear of snakes, study 2. As a control group in both studies, we selected participants with low fear of both animals. Participants were sampled online via Prolific. We conducted a rather simple, straightforward task. In each trial, a picture appeared at the center of the screen depicting a snake or a spider. The animal appeared with pattern or without a pattern. In the global condition, participants were asked to identify the animal, spider or snake, while ignoring its pattern. In the local condition, participants were asked to identify whether or not the animal has a pattern while ignoring the type of the animal. Participants were asked to go as fast and as accurate as possible. Blocks were presented in a random order. Each trial began with a fixation cross shown for 1 second, followed by a picture of a snake or a spider shown for 20 milliseconds. After that, a blank screen appeared for 200 milliseconds and was replaced by fixation cross that remained until the participants made a response. In the global block, participants were asked to press one key if they saw a snake and another key if they saw a spider. And in the local condition, participants were asked to press one key if the animal had pattern and the other key if the animal did not. We chose a threatening animal as a control rather than a neutral image, such as a flower, because we wanted to examine whether or not the effect is specifically generated by the personally relevant stimulus rather than by some biological preparedness to react to stimuli associated with evolutionary danger. Okay, for the result, in the global condition, participants with high fear identified the global configuration of the feared stimulus faster than the fear-irrelevant stimulus. That is, participants with high fear of spiders identified the spider faster than the snake. No such difference was found in identification speed in the low fear group. In the local condition, participants with high fear were slower to identify the local elements of the feared stimulus, i.e. its pattern, than of the fear-irrelevant stimulus. That is, participants with high fear of spiders were slower to identify whether the spider had a pattern or not compared to a snake. Once again, no such difference was found in the low fear group, such that participants with low fear responded similar to spiders and snakes. These results were replicated in study 2, but toward snakes. Furthermore, participants demonstrated an overall global to local bias, therefore confirming the global precedence hypothesis in real-world objects. Interestingly, however, when we examined the magnitude of the global bias, we found a greater global bias among individuals with high fear compared to individuals with low fear, but only towards the fear-relevant stimulus. No difference in the global bias was found between participants with high fear and low fear and for the other threatening but fear-relevant stimulus. That is, participants with high fear of spiders showed a greater global bias to spiders, and participants with high fear of snakes showed a greater bias to snakes. Reliability of the individual differences was computed using the R-split half package. Results indicated the reliabilities of the effects were within the acceptable range. The results indicate that fear influences hierarchical processing by prioritizing the global level of the fear-related stimulus at the expense of its local characteristics. Specifically, participants with high fear are faster in identifying the animal global structure and are slower to identify the local elements. Furthermore, while participants demonstrated a global to local bias regardless to the level of fear, fear was associated with a greater global bias to the fear-related stimulus. The mirror effect obtained in study 2 supports the notion that the effects were due to fear and not to visual features of the stimulus, biological preparedness, or other potential confounds. Furthermore, the reliability estimates of the measurement of the fear group were within acceptable range, highlighting the validity and replicability of the findings. A global precedence effect not only implies an advantage in detectability, but also suggests that the global level interferes with the processing of the local features. That is, when highly fearful individuals encounter a fear-related stimulus, they have difficulties identifying its local characteristics. For example, in Israel, there are 2 types of highly common snakes: the coin-marked snake and the Palestine viper. These 2 types look very similar in that they both have coins on their body. In the case of the coin-marked snake, however, the coins are separated, while the coins of the Palestine viper are attached. The coin-marked snake is not at all dangerous, while the viper bite can be deadly. Our result suggests that if someone with snake phobia encounters one of these snakes, he or she will focus on the animal global configuration. This is a snake, while disregarding the animal local characteristics, whether or not the coins are attached. This global level interference may be translated into difficulty adjusting one's behavior adaptively upon encountering the stimulus. To the best of our knowledge, the current study provides the first evidence for global precedence in processing fear-relevant information. This result it is inconsistent with existing literature, which suggests that anxiety is associated with local precedence. Yet, our findings do not support the broadening of attention, since the global advantage was accompanied by a local disadvantage, suggesting a selectivity of attention. Hence, we suggest that global precedence effect found in the current study can be reconciled with existing literature if we consider narrowing of attention to the global level. Although the theoretical aspects of the current study and existing literature can be reconciled, their clinical implications are in contrast. That is, while existing literature indicates that anxiety should be treated by increasing the global bias, the current study indicates that the opposite is true. That is, that anxiety should be treated by increasing the attention allocation to the local features. However, the causal link between local training and the level of fear should be put to direct examination. An investigation of personally relevant stimuli for testing bias in hierarchical processing has a potential to offer insights into mechanisms underlying other disorders that are not necessarily fear-related. For example, previous findings have used the classical Nahum test or other variation of it, that you can see here, to demonstrate that autism spectrum disorder, ASD, is strongly associated with local bias. Even though the bias has been suggested to play an important role in social impairment, the way in which individuals with ASD process hierarchical levels of socially relevant information has never been examined. Biased hierarchical processing style has been demonstrated using the Nahum test in other disorders, such as schizophrenia and body dysmorphic disorder. Since the processing of personally relevant stimuli seems to be qualitatively different, future studies should examine the role of hierarchical processing by using stimuli that are relevant to the specific emotional and behavioral psychopathology. Taken together, the results of the current study suggest, as Nahum predicted, in ecological stimuli, the processing of global features is prioritized over local features. The processing of fear-related information is associated with a larger global bias. These findings can be reconciled with the attention view in anxiety if we consider the narrowing of attention to the global feature. The findings shed light on global precedence as a new cognitive mechanism associated with fear, which may in turn play an important role in the etiology and maintenance of phobia and serve as a new target for clinical interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, No, for this great talk. Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Please just use the raise hand button and we can just have you ask the questions if you have them.
And no, maybe you want to unshare your, yeah, so now you can see everybody.
Any questions from the group? Okay, if none, then I first of all, I'd like to really thank you for this remarkable presentation and very nice findings and well-conducted study. You talked a little bit about the clinical implications. How does this kind of jive within, let's say, exposure therapy or other attempts to try and overcome phobia, if you can think about these therapeutics? And have you guys attempted anything like that in this domain? Have you guys already attempted to train people for local versus global and see if it affects fear?
No, we didn't. The current study is only in the stage of proof of concept to show that hierarchical processing is associated with that fear plays a role in hierarchical processing. I think that the implication will be that to try to make fearful individuals to be more often experts in their fear-related stimuli, such as that they could distinguish between local elements in a good manner, which then potentially, if the model is correct, could reduce the level of fear. But this is definitely the next stage of our study to look at it, the causal link between the fear and the global bias in life.
So you would rather employ like perceptual learning paradigms to actually train them on that's a very novel approach.
Yeah, like in the snake example that I showed, like to take for example people who have high fear of snakes and try to teach them to distinguish well between types of snakes based on the local pattern.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Any additional questions from the audience?
I
Lily,
actually
go
have
ahead.
Yeah. In this case, the pattern is fear irrelevant or schema irrelevant. So the pattern, having a pattern or being black versus having a pattern doesn't indicate anything about the danger. But if you can think of, black and red, for instance, oftentimes is an indication of danger. So would you say that in some cases, basically what I'm trying to say is whether the local versus global here is confounded to some degree with fear relevant or with dangerous significance. And would you expect that, for instance, if you flipped it so that the pattern is what's important, so like the colors are what's important, and it doesn't matter what the animal is, would you find reverse effects?
I believe that we would, yes. I can think of several examples when the local elements have some silency, or when it's confounded with it, when I know like it signify danger, like great danger, like the color red, so it could draw attention to the local rather than the global elements. But I think that the global hypothesis overall says that overall in a natural environment, usually the global elements are more significant than the local ones to identification. Like the classical paper by Nahum stated that we see the forest before we see the trees. Like it's more important to understand the global in order to understand the situation that we are in. And it is a very I think intuitive to think that the red signified like a great danger, but it's more important to see that we have a snake in front of us or a spider rather than I don't know, like non-dangerous animal. So the processing is going orthogonal way. But yes, of course, if the local elements have some personally relevant to us or signify the great danger or something like that, it could draw potentially attention before the global configuration is processed or being attended to. If it's answer your question, I hope. Okay.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, No.
I wanted to add to Noor's answer. We have some preliminary, it's very, very, very preliminary results with human faces, also led by Noor. And we see that if the emotional expression is relevant, we do see a bias towards the local expression, which we don't see with neutral faces or faces that do not signal some personal relevance. So I think it's a great question, actually, that maybe it is, I mean, we can dive in and see more factors that are motivated this.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So if no additional questions, I think we should move on. Let me just share my screen real quick. Okay.
Actually, maybe I'll present you more,
Sure.
right? Okay, so our next speaker, who is the head of this symposium, is Nahum from the Hebrew University, who will speak about cognitive control in daily life. The floor is yours. Thanks.
Thanks, Adas. Yes, as Hadass mentioned, today's talk will be devoted to cognitive control in daily life and actually showing some results that we have from experience sampling studies in both healthy and in clinical populations. So I know that we all are familiar with the term cognitive control, but really when you look at the literature, there are multiple frameworks that put cognitive control in kind of various or with various definitions. And this particular framework by Pedersen actually puts them all together, showing that there's a lot of overlap between the different frameworks defining cognitive control, which generally talk about the mental processes that are supporting our goal-directed behavior. And we can talk about processes such as inhibitory control, shifting, working memory, and sustained attention as the ones that are required for us in order to obtain our goals. And really what we focus on in this particular talk is a very kind of narrow domain within cognitive control, which is inhibitory control or inhibition, and even a narrower domain within inhibition, which is prepotent inhibition. Right? So if we have like a prepotent response and we need to inhibit it, we often measure it using various tasks. A very acceptable one is the go-no-go task, in which participants are shown a sequence of stimuli. They need to respond as quickly as possible to frequent go stimuli and withhold response to rather rare targets. And by this, we can measure their ability to successfully inhibit responses. And we can manipulate the stimulus set that we use. We can use neutral stimuli. We can use emotionally relevant or irrelevant stimuli, and by that measure various aspects of inhibitory control, which is what we do in various trials. And continuing to think about cognitive control, so it comes across in recent studies as kind of a trans-diagnostic feature. Really, it comes back in multiple diagnoses, in multiple mental health conditions. We can think about mental resilience, depression, anxiety, ADHD, and various conditions in which cognitive control seems to be central to some of the features and to even sometimes even emerging before other symptoms emerge, deficits in cognitive control. So considering mental resilience, for example, our ability to bounce back from adversities, there are frameworks such as the one here by Parsons and colleagues, for example, showing us executive control in the center, controlling our active cognitions and deriving a response to the situation, which in turn kind of feeds back into the cognitive or executive control abilities as determining resilience, and also in depression. So there are multiple cognitive models talking about depressive symptomology, cognitive control in the center, kind of determining cognitive biases on the one hand, cognitive emotion regulation, which feeds back then into depressive symptoms such as sustained negative mood, which in turn affects cognitive control. And in ADHD, for example, an emotion regulation or emotion dysregulation, as we call it in ADHD, similar models suggest a similar kind of central role for cognitive control in these aspects. So, and thinking about the neural mechanisms underlying cognitive control, well, our immediate suspects, as always, is the prefrontal cortex with DLPFC and other relevant areas that exert inhibitory control over limbic system areas. And by this, it kind of ties together the aspects of cognitive control, how it controls or inhibits maybe excessive emotional response and helps us regulate our emotions. And these notions kind of come together within these frontal limbic neural systems. And not surprisingly, when we look at models that talk about these mental health conditions or these neurological conditions, when we often see alterations or abnormalities in these neural structures or functional abnormalities associated exactly with these networks. So this, for example, is a demonstration from ADHD, but we have multiple such studies, imaging studies and others showing abnormalities in depression and in other conditions. So, you know, I hope that I've convinced you that cognitive control is important to understand and study in relation to mental health. But really, we also know that cognitive control may change daily given multiple factors. And current lab-based cognitive control measures are prone to multiple inaccuracies. It's a very kind of common concept that participants, for example, with ADHD would report many deficits in cognitive control in their daily life, but when they come into the lab and do a one-time task, they can excel in it. And the question is, how do we grasp these cognitive control abnormalities? And unfortunately, when you look at the literature, there are very few cognitive ecological or EMA studies to date, ecological momentary assessment, to try and tell us how does cognitive control behave in daily life and how does it change and what can we learn about its ecological manifestation to help us to better understand its association with symptoms. So this is what we try to do in the set of studies that I'm going to show you today. We really study the ecological manifestation of daily cognitive control in relation to mental resilience on the one hand and to emotion dysregulation on the other hand. So how do we do this? I mean, we've had various attempts to do this, kind of various incarnations, so to speak, with our mobile app that we've developed. We started by developing a mobile app, which was part of the BRAIN initiative a few years back. It was called the Moodify app, which we've developed. We've included cognitive control assessments and training and mood reports in it. We now in the lab use kind of a newer version of this application that allows us to also monitor other parameters. And the first study that I'm going to describe is a study that tried to assess mental resilience under stress in relation to daily cognitive control. And again, taking us back to the Parsons model, given the central role of cognitive control in resilience, it seemed appropriate to ask, how does it manifest when there is real stress experience in daily life? And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending if you are a soldier or a researcher, I mean, the life in Israel kind of gives a lot of opportunities to practice stress, so to speak. And this study was completed on a group of newly recruits to IDF. They were drafted to the mixed gender battalions, the border defense battalions, while they were doing their basic combat training in this military base in the southern part of Israel. So we we measured them there about a month after they were drafted. So I think you can agree with me, this is a quite stressful life situation with a lot of kind of unknowns and very different from the routine until that point. And we conducted a kind of a true field study. And one other thing that I should note about this sample is that this is a very unique setup because both male and female participants undergo exactly the same training in the same conditions and then go serve with exactly the same basis doing the same role, which is kind of provides us another opportunity to also measure gender effects. And so we conducted this field study. We installed the Moodify app on their mobile phones, and we recruited 156 soldiers. 98 of them were female. We, at time zero, at baseline, we've monitored, or we asked them to fill out questionnaires related to their mental resilience, mental health, and self-efficacy. We've also measured their cognitive control using a few cognitive control tasks. And then we conducted a 2-week EMA study. Basically, we asked them twice a day in the morning and in the evening to provide us an immediate mood report. How are you feeling right now? And to complete a short go, no go task, a cognitive control task. And they did this twice a day, 5 days a week for 2 weeks. And then at T1, we repeated the baseline battery. And the idea was to try and get a better understanding of how the cognitive control manifestation in daily life is associated with parameters of resilience. So the kind of the initial exploration or the initial check that we did, we looked at just the baseline data, not the EMA data for now. And we looked for this kind of known association between cognitive controllability and mental resilience. And indeed, we found it. So it looks that for more resilient participants, they have a better cognitive control ability if they do the standard, the basic non-emotional go, no-go task. However, psychological distress, we couldn't find such an association. Only when we looked at the emotional version of the go-no-go test, this is where we found the association between psychological distress and inhibitory or cognitive control. Those that had higher levels of self-reported distress had lower inhibitory control, but it was only evident when using an emotional version of the task. We next went on to look at the EMA data. As I said, we started with 156 participants, but we ended up with data from 139 participants, 17 dropped out for various reasons during the EMA period. We were aiming to get 20 data points from each participant. Eventually, we got to an average of 7.5 data sessions from each participant due to a lot of difficulties obtaining these data in field conditions, mainly, very low reception at times. The commanders would not give them the phones and whatnot. It's a kind of a low dose, so to speak, of EMA data, but it's still enough to conduct analysis. And what we looked at first is we wanted to see what predicts their quality of life at time 1, right? So we had time 0, then 2 weeks of EMA, then time 1. And what predicted their quality of life at time 1 were multiple factors that we've envisioned initially, such as psychological resilience and their mental health status, but really the most valuable predictor or the most proximal predictor for quality of life was their momentary mood. So when we look at their average and the variability of their mood reporting in those 2 weeks, we see that it's a very good predictor of their quality of life. And even resilience and mental health are driven by this momentary mood that we've assessed. Another interesting question was, what is the relation between instantaneous or immediate cognitive control and immediate mood in relation to resilience? And here we found very interesting patterns. Those that reported higher levels of resilience at baseline actually show strong association between immediate cognitive control and immediate mood. So in a way, if you have higher resilience, if you have better cognitive control right now, you have better mood right now. If you have bad cognitive control at this minute, you would also have bad mood. This is not the case for people with lower or intermediate levels of resilience. And interestingly enough, as I told you, we have gender effects we could test. This was only true for the female sample of our study, but not for the male sample of our study. So in a way, these kind of interesting, somewhat surprising results actually give us a very nice ecological demonstration of the definition of resilience in real life. Because if you think about it, one interpretation of the results is that more resilient people are able to exert better instantaneous cognitive control in order to control their mood in the moment, right? Whereas those with lower levels of resilience are somewhat not able to do it. Again, this is one interpretation. Again, this is a correlative analysis. So in a way, we don't know what causes what, but this is one interpretation that actually works well with what is suggested in the literature. So kind of shifting gears to another study that used exactly the same tools and exactly the same methodology, but this time to ask a different question. Here we asked, how is emotion dysregulation manifested in ADHD in real life? And why asking this? Well, emotion dysregulation is inability to modulate emotional experience and expression in order to reach one's goals. And we know that it is very prevalent in ADHD. Up to 70% of adults with ADHD tend to report deficits in emotion regulation, show emotion dysregulation. And again, models showing cognitive control deficits to contribute to emotion dysregulation in ADHD, just as the models that I show you at the beginning of the talk. So obviously there is contribution of cognitive control here, but the question is, how is it manifested in daily life? And surprisingly enough, there are no such studies showing this type of data, and we wanted to explore this further. So again, we conducted a field study, this time with 132 young adults. 63 of them had ADHD, 69 were a healthy comparison group. And at baseline, we have recorded emotion dysregulation, self-reported, cognitive control, and quality of life. Then we conducted an EMA study 5 times a day for 5 days. They needed to report their mood and complete a short go, no go cognitive control task. So at baseline, what we could see is that participants with ADHD have higher level of emotion dysregulation. This is, of course, not surprising. We expect this from the literature, and this was reflected in our data. Interestingly, however, we also found that emotion dysregulation somewhat moderated the association between symptoms of ADHD and quality of life. So in a way, we could see that those that have higher levels of emotion dysregulation, it didn't matter for them whether the symptoms were high or low, the quality of life was low anyway. But this was not the case for those with lower levels of emotion dysregulation, the blue line over here. But what we were interested in understanding is the contribution of cognitive control mechanisms to this. And we found a very interesting finding where at baseline, there was no such association, no contribution whatsoever of cognitive control at baseline to emotion dysregulation in any of the groups. However, the contribution comes about when we look at the EMA data. So when we look at the instantaneous data, the immediate kind of the mean of the momentary cognitive control assessments and the instability of the cognitive control assessments, this is where we see that there is a link to emotion dysregulation. Those that have higher levels of emotion dysregulation have lower cognitive control daily on average, and they have higher levels of instability of cognitive control. By the way, this last sentence was true only for those with ADHD, but was not true for controls. So I'm getting to the kind of to the end of my talk and the end of my time here. So I'm just going to conclude and say that what we found is actually this kind of nice, again, ecological demonstration of the contribution of cognitive control, not at baseline, as I told you, as this can change and be rather inaccurate, but rather during EMA or ecological assessment of cognitive control, where higher emotion dysregulation seems to be associated with worse daily average of cognitive control and with more instability in cognitive control. And I think this kind of set of studies actually tells us that ecological momentary assessment contributes greatly to our understanding of cognitive mechanisms associated with mental health. And more studies are kind of ongoing to better understand this, for example, in depression and in other indications. And just to give a hint of where we're taking this next, so we are kind of acknowledging, again, the central role of cognitive control in various indications. So we've developed this platform to deliver a cognitive control video game along with non-invasive brain stimulation for a potential treatment in depression. We had a similar study in ADHD, and we're hoping that the results would actually, again, show causality as well. So I'll conclude here. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and of course, thanking our team at Huji, the collaborators, and our funders. Thank you. Let me just unshare. Thank you. Thanks. Questions?
I have one. I was wondering, first, great talk, really.
Thanks.
So thank you. I was wondering what you think the next step. I mean, okay, the last slide was the next step, but another next step maybe for the ecological in the field studies. Like, would you like to have more tasks or to sharpen the current task, or what is your vision?
So we think about it, that's something that kind of occupies our lab all the time. And I see Netta here in the crowd, she can tell you how much brainstorming we've had on this over the past month. This is kind of breaking our heads because it's very debilitating. Sometimes, I mean, we first need to, we get the results all over the place, and we need to validate the results on various platforms. The reason that there are not many cognitive control EMA studies is because it's very hard to do. And the reason that we like using the go, no go task is exactly this one. It's a task that you can kind of give people to do. You don't have to explain much. You can easily know if the results are reliable or unreliable, like if they really did perform the task as intended, because you're not supposed to, for example, have a lot of errors in this task. It's an easy task to do. So that's why we prefer it, but really we need a very thorough, robust validation of the tasks to be used. We need to assess to measure different metrics associated with performance in the task. And the next step, as we would like to take, is to do more robust kind of computational modeling towards these data. We just started mining it. So really, averages, instabilities, HLMs are kind of first steps. There are multiple models now in effect that can be applied to such data. They require much more data points. So this is why we can't apply them on these data sets, but future data sets should have way more data points and then maybe, better insights into what is going on.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks. I see there's a question from Yuda. Please go ahead.
First, thank you for your talk. It was very inspiring.
Thanks.
I wanted to ask, is there any data regarding similar tasks at aging with older adults? Because we know many of them experience difficulties in cognitive control and mood regulation, etc.
That's an excellent question. We haven't yet started mining data sets on older adults, so I can tell you that. I'm sure there are some studies of this, and I know multiple studies that have used cognitive control tasks in older adults. If that helps, we are starting such a study soon, so we may have an answer maybe next year, but I don't know the literature in this respect, unfortunately. Maybe others know if there are studies like this.
I was wondering about the task, which is very ecological, right? So they can use it at home or... Okay.
You mean using the go task with older adults?
No, but the way you did it, that it was right, not in the lab, but in their homes or during daily routine.
Mm-hmm.
So...
That's exactly how it's conducted. The task is and we know from the literature, by the way, I don't know about the ecological literature, but just from the kind of general literature about older adults and cognitive control, is that they can perform this task well, and you can derive metrics out of it. So I'm pretty sure it will work well as an ecological task with older adults as well.
Just to comment that there's a whole world of background research trying to figure out what would be the best way to collect ecological momentary assessments and online techniques with aging adults as well, because of several technological aspects, and just to make sure that when we have older adults doing these online tasks, we're not doing this, splitting only the sample of the intelligent, having this very extreme bias in the population that we target. So that's a whole big issue of doing these online and, app-based collecting of information with older adults.
Get to our representative sample, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Always an issue. Additional questions or comments?
I want to ask more. It's always a pleasure to hear you. You talked about future training experiments, but I wanted to ask if you saw something in the data, because you already have a lot of points of data. So if you already saw something about training effects in the cognitive control task.
In the EMA, when we use it as an EMA task?
Yeah.
So actually, to be honest, no. And the reason, I think, again, there is a clear dissociation when we use a task as an assessment task and when we use it for training. When we apply cognitive training principles, we actually try to drive learning and changes, right? So we do a task which is an adaptive task. We individualize it to fit. Here, as an assessment task, we actually do not do that. We try not to make it adaptive, even though there are assessments that are adaptive, but we don't use adaptive tasks. And we actually try to make the tasks such as that we would minimize learning effects. And in fact, when you look at cognitive EMA studies, the few that there are, Sometimes they would give participants the task, just do them 5 times in a row, just do the task, kind of, neutralize all procedural learning effects that you can, and just use the task as is to actually not include learning effects within the EMA, which may kind of contaminate the EMA data. So that's actually an excellent question that we've been thinking about a lot, but for example, in the go, no-go task, we have not seen. And in fact, if anything, if I remember correctly, Netta, correct me if I'm wrong, there was even a negative learning effect or something like that in the data. I think we're way past the time already, so we should stop the discussion here and move on to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Nili Mol from the Hebrew University, who will talk to us about the links between within the event controllability, causal inferences, emotion regulation, and symptoms of depression. Nili, go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. Thank you for joining our symposium. I wanted to also thank Mor for organizing it and also for providing this lovely introduction to EMA research and start from there. So thank you. Okay, so my starting point is looking at the hopelessness theory of depression. And the hopelessness theory of depression defines a negative causal inferential style as a dispositional risk factor for depression. This inferential style defines our responses to negative events in particular. So let's say that somebody fails an exam. A negative inferential style would indicate that they attribute specific causes to this failure. So they would attribute it to internal causes. I failed the exam because I'm not smart, because I'm stupid. Okay, that's internal. To stable. So I'm stupid means that I'm not stupid just now, but rather stable over time. And global, meaning that it's not just in math that I'm stupid, but I'm stupid all across, okay? So it's global and not specific to a certain domain. Negative inferential style also involves thinking about dire consequences. So failing this exam would have negative consequences for the future, and it has severe or significant implications for the self. Generally speaking, the negative inferential style or hopelessness theory talks about a style, a cognitive style, something that describes people across situations, right? And numerous studies have shown both concurrently and predicting to the future that hopelessness or that negative inferential style is a predictor of depression. But the theory is also describing proximal determinants of negative mood or depressed mood, and looking at negative inferences that can refer not just as a style, but can refer to specific events. So what are the inferences that I make for specific events? When I failed in a particular situation, what causal inferences did I make, okay? And those can actually change from one situation to another, okay? Interestingly, the momentary effects of inferences have mostly been disregarded or neglected in the literature. Some recent evidence suggests that negative inferences for daily negative events do correlate with depressive symptoms. And what we were interested in is what determines inferences in specific situations. Moreover, we were interested in what role these inferences, play in responses to daily negative events, and how are they linked to emotion regulation in response to these events. One factor that we thought, so if we're trying to look at events specifically and looking at what determines people's inferences to these events and how these inferences may be linked to emotion regulation, one factor that may be really relevant is attributions of controllability. So whether we think that this event, that the particular event that we're encountering, whether we think that the consequences of this event are controllable or not. So for instance, let's say that I failed an exam. Do I have an opportunity for a makeup exam to take a moed bet, a second time of this exam? So the consequences of this event are still controllable. I can still do something to control the negative consequences of the event. Or there may be situations where the event is sort of ended and there's no control over what happens consequently. The perceived controllability of the consequences of the event do affect people's reactions. So recent research has shown that they do affect people's reactions to negative events. However, the link between perceived controllability and the inferences, so looking from what we think the consequences might be and whether I can control them, to our perceptions about what might have caused the event to begin with, that relationship has not been examined. So linking the three together, controllability, inferences, and emotion regulation, some of the work in the past has shown that the effects of that controllability does have an effect on emotion regulation. So perceived control over stressors was related to more active coping responses. So when I think that the event is still ongoing, that things can still change, I will engage in more active coping. Similarly, inferences have also been related to emotion regulation strategy use. So in our work, we've shown that training people to make positive inferences reduce their ruminative responses. But linking these things together, we know what still is unknown is what are the cognitive mechanisms that may link perceived controllability and emotion regulation. We also don't know what are the links between inferences and emotion regulation beyond rumination. And importantly, if our starting point was depression, then looking at these intricate relationships between controllability, inferences, and emotion regulation in depressed versus non-depressed people may give us some clues as to understanding the mechanisms through which inferences affect or promote risk for depression. So the aims of our current research were to examine links between event controllability or perceived controllability of the consequences of the event and inferences in real-life ecological settings. We wanted to see whether depression would moderate those links, okay, and whether these links would be stronger among depressed versus non-depressed individuals. We wanted to examine links between inference negativity and emotion regulation strategy use. And we focused on, so we expanded our work on brooding to looking at reappraisal, problem solving, and behavioral disengagement. And as you can see, the first two strategies that we looked at were cognitive strategies of processing the event, and the latter two are more behavioral ones, so problem solving versus disengagement or distracting oneself from the event. And we looked at both the choice or the propensity to use emotion regulation strategies and their success in terms of their effect on mood. And again, we wanted to see whether depression would moderate the relationship between inference negativity and emotion regulation success. So to examine these questions, we invited 113 students from the Hebrew University participated in this study. And it was an EMA study conducted on their computers. Participants were invited to a pre-diary session in which we explained the procedures of the study, and they completed trait questionnaires and a few other tasks that I'm not going to describe today. Then they participated in 2 weeks of diary measures, which I will elaborate on in a minute. And in the diary procedures, we asked them to report negative life events We asked them about the controllability of these events, the negativity and the meaningfulness of these events, and their coping and emotion relation strategies they used to handle these events, and the emotions aroused by these events. And then finally, after these 2 weeks, we also asked them to complete again self-report trait measures. So following, here's the design, the pre-diary, diary period, and the post-diary session. And let me focus a bit on the diary period, which is a bit, it's a bit of a complicated procedure. So during the day, participants completed 5 times. They were beeped at random times, 5 times a day. And we asked them to report, since the last beep, what was your most negative and your most positive event. And then we asked them how controllable they thought that event was, and we asked them about their feelings, how negative or positive, what their feelings were in response to this event. At the end of the day, so this was so during the day, 5 times a day was rather brief because we wanted to get as many events as we could. Basically, they're reporting on 10 different events, 2 events each time. And therefore, we needed to keep the descriptions rather brief. At the end of the day, we asked them for a more elaborate description. And here at the end of the day, the computer selected the 2 most negative events of the day, and then we asked them for more elaborate descriptions. So we asked for contextual information, what life domain that event, so was it a family event, was it a academic event, and so forth. We asked them to describe the main cause of that event. So let's say they said they had an argument. So please describe what made you have this argument. And then they described on a scale, the CSQ scale, they rated the inference, the main cause, for internality, globality, specificity, stability, sorry. Again, we asked them again about controllability of the event, negativity and meaningfulness. We asked them about their coping with the event and the emotion regulation, the degree to which they engage in these 4 emotion regulation strategies I described earlier, and their emotional reaction, their feelings towards the event. We also asked them for information about the day, general information about the day, daily activities and stressors during the day. And we ended with questions about the most positive event of the day. We actually didn't analyze these data. We just wanted to make sure, again, that participants don't end with this negative focus on negative events and elaborate description of negative events. So we asked them to also report on the positive event of the day. Okay, and what were our predictions? So our first predictions pertain to emotion regulation, and we examined a moderated mediation model where controllability affects emotion regulation choice via negative inferences, and we predicted that this relationship would be different with varying depressive symptom levels. First, looking at participants' reappraisal, and our predictions were confirmed. So controllability indeed, so higher levels of attributed controllability indeed made people or contributed to people's use of reappraisal. And for depressed participants, this is the moderated relationship. So for depressed participants, this effect was moderated by their inferences. So depressed participants, for them, more controllability predicted more use of negative inferences, which in turn predicted less reappraisal. Okay, so depressed participants engaged in less reappraisal, and they did that through the use of more negative inferences. If we're looking at predicting brooding, so controllability predicts more brooding, and for the whole sample, it predicts it through the use of negative inferences. So more controllability predicts the use of more negative inferences, and then in turn, more brooding. This is true for the whole sample, but it's particularly true for depressed participants. We see a different pattern for problem solving. So again, here what we see is that controllability predicts inferences, but inferences don't predict problem solving, and this is not moderated by depression. And similarly, we see that for behavioral disengagement. So controllability contributes to behavioral disengagement. More controllability makes people disengage less, but this is not mediated by negative inferences, and it's not mediated by depression. Moving ahead, looking at the effectiveness of emotion regulation and its effect on mood change, and whether participants reported on their mood as right after the event and in the evening. And we wanted to see whether there was a mood improvement through the day, which was mediated by emotion regulation, and whether that was moderated by depression. And what we see here is that negative inferences predict mood change, and for depressed participants, it does so through reappraisal. So negative inferences predict reappraisal for depressed participants, and hence, so when depressed participants make negative inferences, they engage in less reappraisal, and as a result of that, they show less improvement in their mood. And you don't see that for non-depressed participants. For brooding, negative inferences predict less improvement in the mood, and it does so through the use of brooding, and it does so for everyone, but mostly for depressed participants. So mostly depressed participants, when they make negative inferences, it leads them to engage in more brooding, and the result of that is reduced ability to feel better at the end of the day. So to summarize, people respond to events they perceive as controllable with higher levels of multiple forms of emotion regulation. They engage in more brooding, more reappraisal, more problem solving, and less behavioral disengagement. Controllable events are associated with more negative inferences, and more so among depressed individuals. Across the entire sample, we found that negative inferences mediated the effect of event controllability on brooding, and this is especially strong for depressed individuals. Negative inferences mediated the effect of event controllability and reappraisal only among depressed participants. So for them, controllable events are associated with more negative inferences, which in turn reduce their use of reappraisal. We also found mood effects. So across the entire sample, negative inferences lead to increased brooding, which in turn lead to more negative mood. And among depressed participants, negative inferences lead to reduced reappraisal, which then leads to more negative mood. In conclusion, what we can say is that causal inferences affect emotion regulation strategies that involve cognitive processing, but not behavioral strategies. We also see that negative inferences are negative or detrimental or maladaptive for depressed participants in two ways. They both increase their brooding more so than for the general population, and they hamper reappraisal. And I think the most important kind of take-home message from this work is that although years of research has looked at causal inferences and negative inferential style, as a personality characteristic. And our work indicates the importance of looking at inferences as they take place in, or as they play a role in emotion regulation processes. Therefore, further research should really use idiographic approaches such as those EMA studies to examine inferences in real life rather than as a cognitive style. I'd like to thank you for your listening and thank students in the Cognition and Emotional Lab, especially Noah Averbach, this is part of her dissertation research, and she couldn't be here today to present this work, and our funding from the ISF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nivi, for this wonderful talk. Questions from the audience?
I have one.
Hi.
Thank you, very interesting talk. I'm just wondering, as an outsider to this field, you treated perceived controllability as an independent variable or as a moderator variable. And I wonder why or whether it might be considered as a dependent variable as well. It's an attribution that might very well be affected by depression or other characteristics. And if you had tried to fit a model in which it is actually affected by rather than a contributing factor, whether it might lead to further insights.
So thank you for this question. Actually, I kind of glossed over that, but we do find differences in controllability. So it is predicted by depression level. And it is related to depression, and it is related to to a global tendency to make, so we also have trait measures of inferential style. So it's also related to those trait measures. So definitely the picture is rather complex. One important thing I want to add is that when we looked at inferences, one might say that internal inferences can be very similar to the consequences. So in all our analyses, we took out the internality factor and examined it without internality so that we don't confound internality and the controllability, and we find the effects without the internality. So it's not explained by that as well. But thank you for your question. Other questions?
I have one question.
Hi, Ada.
I was wondering if you thought about adding tasks to these questionnaires, or do you think it's just not feasible to kind of repeat the same task 3 times a day over a few days?
So yeah, I mean, especially if you're thinking about the work that Moore has just presented, definitely I think it would be really interesting to think about different levels of cognition. So these inferences are really kind of conscious. People are aware of these cognitions, I think, and it's you could think of it as sort of like higher order cognition and self-reported. And I think it would be really interesting to look at that in conjunction with cognitive control or attention mechanisms and so forth. One thing to take into account is that when asking about these cognitive processes, these inferences, it's quite laborious because people have to think about the event, they write a cause, they rate it, they've answered a lot of questions about their mood, about the event. So we really have to think about participant burden, and that was one reason why we didn't add daily tasks to this. But you know, there's always a trade-off in terms of what you put in and what you take out. So yeah.
Related to that, Nili, how was the retention rate? I mean,
interestingly, you know, we didn't assess soldiers in the desert, so our retention.
Lucky you.
Yeah. So we had a few participants who didn't complete so I think it was just like 2 or 3 who didn't complete the study. And then in terms of the percentage of compliance, it was I think it was above 90% of so participants really responded to, we have a very large amount of data from this work, because participants really were diligent in replying 5 times a day and then daily in the evening. So it worked out nicely.
Very remarkable. Additional questions, comments? Okay, if not, then we'll thank Nili once more. Thank you for this great talk. And we'll move right on to our next speaker, Sharon Naparstek from Bar-Ilan University, who will talk about predicting treatment outcome in veterans with PTSD, a neurocognitive approach. So I think, Sharon, you're here, right?
Sharon has some connection issues.
Yeah, she had some connection issues.
She's not here at the moment.
She's not.
I guess she's trying to connect.
She may be trying to connect. She texted me that she had some connection issues, which may happen. So I have her talk. I can kind of share the screen as soon as she comes on. So let's just wait.
Maybe I can ask Nili another question in the meantime.
Sure, go ahead.
We'll start the discussion now and then move to the talk. I was wondering about the controllability, because it was kind of counterintuitive to me. So, like, what I mean is that when, like, if you think about the definition of FLAN for emotion, it's like you have valence, arousal, and controllability. And usually, kind of when I explain to students, I tell them that when you don't feel in control in the situation, fear is much stronger. And here, the results are the other way around. And I was wondering whether it's because these are specifically for the negative situations, and maybe having had more like stronger positive situations, we would have seen the opposite correlation for positive things, maybe something else. So I wondering about it.
So first of all, thank you. This is a very interesting question, and it's a very interesting issue that we've been grappling with, because the literature is really, at first we thought that the effects would be driven by a sense of uncontrollability, as you suggested. I think, first of all, our definition here of controllability is a unique one, in the sense that we're looking at not whether you can control whether the event occurs in the first place. And it was really important for us to, but rather what we did was to look at whether you can control the consequences of what would happen following the event. And the reason we wanted to really make that distinction was that if you think about what causes the event, whether you can control whether the event will take place, then you're already confounding that with internality of the inference, right? I failed the exam because I'm stupid, so then I can control or because I didn't sleep well, then you can control the occurrence of the event by sleeping better, right? So the question is not so much whether I can, and I think with anxiety, that's the issue. It's the issue of whether you can control whether the event will take place in the first place. But what we were mostly interested here is whether I think that the event, that once the event has occurred, I still can do something. And I think that's the interesting thing here with the emotion regulation strategies. And that was a surprising finding for us, because we found that people engage in more brooding and in more reappraisal, and you would think that they would, or in more problem solving, right? The more controllable the event was. But the thing was that they were just being very active. So if I can do something about the event, then I'll try to do whatever I can. So I think that's part of the issue, that the definition here of controllability is of the consequences of whether something, whether the event has stopped or not. And that's why you see the activity and so forth. Yeah, but I definitely think that the links between controllability of the event, inferences, and emotional regulation I see this as a first step, and I think that we need to further examine these relationships.
I agree. I think I was thinking about Noor's study, and they think that kind of if we train participants and we make them experts, as Noor suggested, now they can recognize then they should feel more in control. But then, I mean, you can think about two options. One is to kind of continue to blame themselves, like I should have not go to this forest or whatever because I know there are snakes there. Kind of maybe this disengagement or avoidance behavior. Kind of you don't deal with these controllability issues at all. It's something that we usually avoid. Like we don't test these like the attention mechanisms or other cognitive biases, controllability, and different consequences that are optional.
I think that's sort of, I mean, that was our interpretation of the findings with depression, is that it's more of a blaming, you know, it's the, if I see that I have, that I can control the consequences of the event, then, you know, then I have, you know, some more blame, you know, that's why you see more of these negative inferences. I have more blame, it's more global, it's more stable. They sort of connect the consequences with personal attribution. I see that, I think I see that.
So Sharon is here, so
Sharon is
we should
here.
probably move on.
Yep, let's give it a try. We'll kind of try, I'll try to share my screen. I have Sharon's presentation and Sharon will be speaking. So just 1 second. We'll give it a try and see how it goes. 1 second. Okay, Sharon, can you give it a try?
I can't see her now.
Oh.
Are you still with us, Sharon? Oh, no.
No, we lost her again?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, she said she had some tech issues there and the internet is...
Hear me?
No, Sharon, it's not working.
I see myself. Yes, but I can hear you guys.
But you're coming off very it's unstable.
Sharon, do you want to try to talk again?
Do we want to give it a try, or is the bandwidth? Yes, can you hear me now, or is the bandwidth too low for this? Okay, let's give it a try. I'll try to. Okay. So I apologize. I really had to miss the last talk. So sorry for that. Internet issues around here. I'll give it a best shot right now. I'm happy to be part of this session, and thank you all for joining in and for inviting me. And I love the idea of this session, and happy to share some work that I carried out during my time at Stanford. Mo, you can move into the next slide.
I did. This one, PTSD?
Yeah, so I see the first one. Okay, so if we're on number 2 with the PTSD, I will talk about post-traumatic stress disorder today. Post-traumatic stress disorder, a debilitating condition that might occur following the exposure to a life-threatening event. And I think what's interesting about it is that it's characterized by affecting many aspects of one's living, including cognitive, emotional, behavioral aspects, but also things that are related to interpersonal relationship and the ability to maintain your workplace, and even physical health. And according to recent World Health Organization reports, the worldwide population prevalence is anywhere between 4 and 8%, with higher prevalence around areas of conflict, such as people living in Israel. Mo, you can proceed. So talking about treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, it is widely agreed that trauma-focused psychotherapy are frontline therapies for PTSD. And this is also found by several meta-analyses showing that their efficacy is much higher than other types of treatment, including medication. However, these interventions are far from perfect. Because they cast such a huge burden on the individuals coping with PTSD, first of all, there are high dropout rates. So studies report anywhere between 20 and 40%. These are much higher than dropout rates for example, in depression. A second thing to consider is that there's high variability in outcome, ranging between individuals that show the expected decrease in symptoms, those that show no change, and those that show an increase in symptoms. And finally, because they necessitate specific training, their availability is quite limited, especially when we move out of big cities into smaller areas everywhere around the world. Next slide. Currently, we have very little ability to predict or know ahead of time who will respond well to what type of treatment, whether it's psychotherapy, medication, or other. Next slide. And the objective of the current study was to develop tools that will help us stratify patients based on their expected therapeutic response. And by doing so, we hope to assist both the clinician and the individual coping with PTSD to choose the best therapy for them right now. Next slide. So what kind of tools would we like to develop? And I will first, you can go ahead and just, I think there's an animation there. I would like to suggest that we would search for tools that are robust, meaning that they measure or track an aspect that is tightly related to the disorder. And of course, this session is about cognitive abilities. So what better candidate do we have than cognitive abilities? You can move ahead, Mo. And in PTSD, there are several explanatory models that identify memory and learning as key concepts in explaining the disorder. So some of them highlight the role of memory and learning in the fragmented memory in the development and maintenance of the disorders, and others highlight the role of memory as a key feature in the therapeutic process. So in the next slide, you would not be surprised to see, and there's an animation there also, that in this meta-analysis here, looking at something like 60 studies covering more than 4,000 participants with PTSD and controls, and looking at an array of neurocognitive domains, verbal learning and memory show the largest effect size, the larger difference between PTSD and controls. Kind of, I think, making them a good candidate is something to study when looking into PTSD. Next slide would be, how do we study learning and memory? So the clinicians here in the audience might recognize the Ray Auditory Verbal and Learning Test. That is one of the most widely used tools to assess learning and memory. And I like it very much because it is one of the only tools that has standardized norms for Hebrew and Arabic speaking examinees, which is why this is what we use here in clinical settings. In the next slide, you can see how administered in the classical pencil and paper in-person administration. The examinee is repeatedly presented with a list of words, and following each presentation is asked to recall as many words as they can recall. After 5 such repetitions, there's an interference trial followed by an immediate and delayed trial where participants are asked to recall the list without additional presentation. And the scores derived are the number of correct words for each list, but also there are a set of composite scores developed by Eli Vakil and others that tap upon higher cognitive abilities such as learning, executive functions, and even attention. So in the next slide, it's a bit off topic, but maybe not. We had several study cohorts and collaborations. We were hoping to find a way to really standardize the way we give the test. And what we decided to do was move into a computerized version of this in-person administration. And why is this important? So I think, first of all, like I said, just standardizing administration, not only in the way we administer the test, but also minimize the bias in scoring, which is a big issue. Second, when we use computerized tests and tools, I won't have time to go into it today, but we can add additional measures such as response time or detection time that are highly valuable in many populations. Of course, computerized tools increase the accessibility. So we've all kind of moved in telehealth giving therapy, but there were a lot of discussions on how we can run diagnostics and assessment, we can do a better job or start doing something about that. And finally, I think that the use of computerized tools makes them more accessible. So we can share the test, we can share the data, we can improve the noise that we use. And this is kind of like promoting an open science approach. So in order to computerize the test, we had to make some changes. The two major ones were, in the next slide, you can see, we've changed the way we present the cue, the word. Instead of giving them verbally, we had to present them visually. So you can see here, maybe it's a bit too small, but the stream of words, the timings here were chosen after several in-person and online iterations. If anyone wants to know more, I'm happy to discuss. And the second, you can see in the next slide, we had to change the format in which we collect the responses. So instead of these auditory responses, participants had to type in the responses. This test was then validated on a very large sample of almost 800 individuals, healthy adults, and we found that overall performance was similar to that of the pencil and paper. So we were happy to use this as our, let's say, robust cognitive measure. Next slide, sorry, this is just the validation sample, and we can move into the next question. So Mo, you can go ahead and do all the animations. There's another. So let's say that go back. So I've convinced you that we need to use a robust tool, that cognitive abilities are a good candidate, and that memory is the winning one. The next type of tool that we wanted to use are objective measures, and now you can move into the next slide. I'll say a word about resting state connectivity. So dating back early to Carl Friston's work, these are these low frequency brain fluctuations that we observe in the brain of a person who is not engaged in a task. And it has been suggested that that these connectivities are very important to enable the brain to process information adaptively. So when these networks are perturbed, it might underlie some cognitive deficits that we see in many fields, including psychopathology. And of the 7 major networks described by Thomas Yeo and others, I will focus today on the ventral attention. It's the pink network around the ventral frontal cortex and the temporoparietal junction. And this network is involved in this bottom-up orientation of attention to very salient stimuli in the environment. So we can kind of think why it is relevant or important for anxiety, but also PTSD. And those were mostly studied using fMRI. And in the next slide, you can see that indeed following this rationale, a previous work has shown that individuals suffering from PTSD that have low memory abilities and low connectivity also show almost little or almost no improvement in therapy. But this study, you can go to the next slide, this study was conducted using fMRI, which is a costly tool that is very limited, which is why the last thing we wanted to do is create a tool that is clinically accessible using a computerized test, but also studying resting state networks using EEG. Mo, I'm in slide 22. We have EEG as the title. Thank you. So a word about EEG. Compared to fMRI, it is much cheaper and is available in many clinical settings. It has high temporal resolution, but also suffers from low spatial resolution because, as you all know, we measure the signal on the scalp, but it originates deep within the brain. And in the process of propagating through the layers of the brain, it carries out a lot of noise. This is called the volume conduction problem. It is one of the reasons that resting state networks were not measured using EEG. So a recent method developed in my previous group at Stanford developed a way to clean the signal by applying orthogonalization, a mathematical parameters on the raw data, which enables us to clean out the noise and actually get a signal that we can then extract resting state networks, much like the ones we can find in fMRI. So in the next slide, you can see the procedure for the study. We had 153 veterans, all diagnosed as suffering from PTSD, participate in the study. Interestingly, and this is also an issue that we can always discuss, they had a wide age range from early 20s to late 70s. So we had Iraq and Afghanistan, but also Vietnam veterans with PTSD. So we had, and they came into the lab, and we ran many questionnaires and assessments that will focus on their clinical assessment, on the memory test, and on resting state EEG. They then went back to their home clinics where they underwent trauma-focused psychotherapy and came back to us after the therapy. And the question of interest today is whether these baseline measurements moderate the therapeutic outcome, or whether we can use this information to say something about outcome. Next slide, please. The way we address this question is by looking at linear mixed effect models and examining cognition and connectivity each time. I'll just move on to the results. So in the next slide, we can see the first question I asked is whether memory abilities at baseline moderate outcomes. So on the y-axis over here, you can see PTSD severity with with higher scores denoting more severe condition. And on the x-axis, we can see timelines. So we have the baseline measurement and the post. There were additional time points along the way, specifically a midline that I took off for visual clarity. And what each dot over here is an individual with pink ones denoting those that had high memory abilities and green ones low memory abilities. And what is evident that regardless of memory abilities, all individuals show a decrease in symptoms. So one, therapy works, and two, we don't have an effect of moderation by memory. Next slide, we can look at connectivity. And here again, the pink dots are those with high connectivity, the green dots are those with low connectivity. And regardless of connectivity strength, all individuals show a decrease in symptom. However, when we combine the two, and this is in the next slide, we can see this nice interaction. So in the next slide, you can see, first of all, the individuals with high connectivity, so pink here in the figure is high memory and green is low memory, we don't see a difference on the left panel. But in the right panel, and there's an animation there, we can see this nice interaction where individuals with low brain connectivity and low memory abilities show little or almost no change in therapy. Okay, so this is actually this phenotype combining the memory and connectivity. So just moving into what these findings mean, in the next slide, so we find this interaction between features. So memory alone does not moderate or predict outcome. Connectivity alone does not. It's the interaction between the two of them. And what does this exactly mean? So it means we need both the memory abilities and this basic ability to transfer information clearly over the brain that helps us to understand who will thrive or benefit from therapy. These findings replicate and extend the previous findings, but this time using clinically accessible tools, the EEG and the computerized test. And I didn't show this here, but we find this pattern across many measures, so different ways of addressing or studying PTSD by DSM-4, by DSM measures. So in the next slide, just going back to the question of, okay, so now we've stratified this group, and I told you that high memory with high or low connectivity are really the best fit for trauma-focused psychotherapy. But I mean, the big question is, what about those who do not fit this pattern? And here, I think that we are at the edge of, this is the time for us to be more creative, cognitive flexibility, show our cognitive flexibility in developing new methods and interventions, but that will address this specific population. So in the next slide, just several thoughts could be going towards enhancement of either their memory abilities or their brain connectivity prior to therapy. So enhancement of cognitive abilities and specifically of memory is already practiced in many different populations. There are nice studies in psychosis showing that the added value of cognitive training for memory before going into any intervention. And as for the enhancement of brain connectivity, there are several studies looking at the role of repetitive TMS in depression, and now also from our group in PTSD. And the idea of doing this ahead of therapy to kind of boost and give these individuals the boost they need, the starting point, is an interesting avenue, in my opinion. So just to summarize, and I'm sorry for this hectic way to present, I think that this path going through the use of adaptive tools and methods like other presenters today, the combination of subjective and objective measures, and the idea of stratifying patients in therapy by their outcome kind of leads us towards the ability to better diagnose, to make our therapies more personalized, but also the development of more novel interventions that are targeted for specific populations. Just like in the last slide, to acknowledge collaborators on this study and funding, which is always important. And lastly, thank you so much for joining. I don't know if there's time for any questions. I kind of rushed through. So Mo, you will let me know.
Thank you. Sure, there is time for questions. Thank you so much, Sharon, for this heroic effort over technological hurdles. That was quite impressive. Let's open the floor for discussion. Questions, comments?
I can't see you also. If there's a question, Mo, let me know.
I will.
Apologize for that.
So if there are no questions from others, then first of all, Sean, let me just say that this was really remarkable to see these efforts. I've known some of these studies, intervention studies in PTSD for a while, and I know how difficult it is to try and find kind of what drives treatment success. Can you say a little bit more about what was the treatment? Was it kind of a standard psychotherapy treatment that they give everyone? Everyone gets the same treatment, basically?
A great question. You're just like with your two. So we had the treatment that was given here was either the prolonged exposure or the cognitive processing therapy. Both of them are pretty much similar in, I'd say that overall, both of them are the classical CBT trauma-focused psychotherapies that are defined as like evidence-based and practiced regularly at the VAs in the US. There were two types of therapy. One of the things we wanted to find out is whether they are different in the treatment prediction or outcome, and we found no differences between them. This is something to note. So therapy arm did not interact here. There's a big issue about the way we can control, right? Because we had 150 or 160 veterans, each one of them receiving the therapy at a different site with different therapists and different supervision. And that's a big issue to control for that. So overall, I can say that they receive trauma-focused CBT. I don't think we're strict enough in controlling the therapy itself and making sure that it's very strict by the protocol, and that's a problem here.
Thank you. Any additional questions? Our original plan was to actually, plan for a lively panel discussion. We don't have much time for this. I don't know, Hadass, would you like maybe us to?
Maybe we'll just kind of bring one thought, and maybe each of the speakers can say one sentence just to kind of give the audience something to think about. So I think what impressed me most in this wonderful session was the kind of the diversity of very ecological tasks versus very kind of traditional controlled lab experiments. And I was wondering, I wanted to ask kind of, imagine that nobody's here, right? So what are the real pros and cons in this? Because kind of Morse mentioned that it's challenging to measure soldiers in the field. So kind of maybe in one sentence, the pros and cons, like for your next study, would you go for a more ecological one or a lab controlled one? This for the speakers.
Wow, excellent question. Do you guys want to address it? Maybe Nili, Nu, Sharon?
Sure, I can start. I think I have two thoughts about it. One comes from the perspective of cognitive bias modification procedures, where today I feel a little bit more disillusioned by these. I've been using these procedures for many years now, and it seems like the effects there are really variant. So sometimes researchers find effects and sometimes they don't. And I think the time is really ripe to try and understand, to take these procedures to real life and to try and see why it is. So people can be trained to change their cognitive processes, but that doesn't always transfer to emotional disorders or to real life. So people may apply it in the lab, but then in day-to-day, they don't change their appraisals or their attention or whatever. So I think the time is really ripe to move these procedures and examine them more so in real life. And the other answer I have is that I think that that really both perspectives are needed. I think that daily research is, and ESM is really needed. But on the other hand, as I was talking, I used causal language, and then I realized, oops, I should have changed that to prediction and whatever, because it's not really, in diary studies, you're not really examining causality. So I think the combination of two, of studying things in daily life and then examining them, bringing them back to the lab to examine causality is really important. So that's my 2 cents.
I would add to this. I mean, of course, I'm biased, right? But still, I would think that you would need to think very carefully about which paradigms can be applied via EMA or remotely even. We're now struggling, breaking our heads with depression data that doesn't behave as we would like it to behave. And gazillion factors are actually in effect here, right? When you're applying it remotely, if they used it on a tablet or a mobile device, if they did this from home or in a noisy environment or in a quiet environment, and you can't really control for them. So I would say, only very robust tests that you know how you expect them to behave and you can rely on the data as applied remotely is very critical. You really lose control. When you kind of set your study, remotely, and people get used to it and they do it kind of very sporadically or inattentively, and then you would just analyze garbage data, right? So we need to be very mindful about the kind of tasks that we apply remotely. But if we do apply the right tests, I think these data can be very valuable.
No, or Sharon, you want to add something?
I would like to offer another perspective. Yeah, if it's okay. I'm just thinking about another, can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think another, I'm also thinking about the way we can collect data, diagnostic about like real neuropsych abilities and cognitive abilities, because many times you find that what people perform in the clinic is just doesn't.
Oh, you're breaking, Sharon.
Give us enough about their day-to-day is how we take these tools and measures. I want just to mention the idea of also thinking about ways of making cognitive diagnostics and assessments more ecologically valid. That's another issue that I think is like in the background of this.
I'm in a complete agreement with everything that you said. I have nothing to add to it, only that I think that we need to also move forward towards using reliability estimates for our task. But everything else, I'm also in a complete agreement. So thank you more for this symposium.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. So I think we're already kind of a few minutes past our time. So it's time to say goodbye, have you, grab a cup of coffee and come back to, I think, the poster session that starts at 3:30. So thanks, everyone. I'd like to thank
you,
our
Mo,
speakers.
for a beautiful symposium. And see you all in the poster session in a few minutes.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.